Welcome to a very different kind of tour. Today, we're visiting the graves of musicians who were once household names, artists who sold millions of records, topped the charts, filled arenas, and appeared on every television set in America. And yet, if you mentioned their names to your grandchildren today, you'd probably get a blank stare in return. Fame, it turns out, has a shorter shelf life than most of us would like to believe. These 40 musicians all had their moment in the spotlight, some for a few blazing years, some for decades. Their songs were the soundtracks to first dances and road trips, to Saturday nights and Sunday mornings. They were as famous as anyone in America, and their voices were as familiar as the voices of your own family. And now they rest in cemeteries across this country and beyond, visited mostly by the devoted few who still remember what it felt like to hear those songs for the first time. So let's get started. We have a lot of ground to cover, and a lot of music to remember. Our first stop is Bossier Parish, Louisiana, at Hillcrest Memorial Park in the small city of Horton, where beneath tall southern pines rests a singer who had one of the biggest novelty hits in country music history. Johnny Horton's The Battle of New Orleans, a rollicking, fiddle-driven account of Andrew Jackson's 1815 victory over the British, spent 10 weeks at number 1 on the country charts and 6 weeks atop the pop charts in 1959, a crossover smash at a time when country artists rarely cracked the pop top 40. It won the Grammy for Best Country and Western Recording. Horton followed it with Sink the Bismarck and North to Alaska, the latter written for the John Wayne film of the same name. He called himself the Singing Fisherman, having actually worked the commercial fishing trade in Alaska before music drew him back south. His career was on a steep upward trajectory when fate intervened. In the weeks before his death, Horton reportedly told friends and family he was having premonitions that he would die young, killed by a drunk driver. He even spoke about it from the stage. On November 5, 1960, driving home to Shreveport after a concert in Austin, Texas, his car was struck head-on by a drunk driver on a narrow bridge outside Milano, Texas. Horton died en route to the hospital at the age of 35. One eerie footnote: Horton's widow, Billie Jean, had previously been married to Hank Williams, who died on New Year's Day, 1953. She lost 2 of country music's brightest stars before she turned 30. And Horton's last concert? It was performed at the Skyline Club in Austin, the very same venue where Hank Williams had played his final show. From Louisiana, let's travel northwest to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Memorial Park Cemetery, where rests the man who invented an entire genre of American music. Bob Wills was the king of Western swing, and if that title doesn't ring a bell, think of it this way. He took the fiddle music of rural Texas, married it to big band jazz and the blues, and created a sound that made dance halls across the Southwest shake on their foundations for 2 solid decades. With his band, the Texas Playboys, at their peak, an 18-piece orchestra, Wills pioneered a fusion that helped lay the groundwork for what would eventually become rock and roll. His signature shout, a hollered "aha" dropped into the middle of songs, became one of the most recognizable ad-libs in American music. And his stage presence was electric. He wore a cowboy hat and a huge grin and led his band like a man who couldn't believe his own good luck. He was a showman of the first order, pointing at soloists, calling out their names, hooting and hollering encouragement like a rodeo announcer. San Antonio Rose, originally a fiddle instrumental called New San Antonio Rose, became a massive hit in 1940 after Wills added lyrics. Bing Crosby's cover sold millions more copies. At the height of his popularity during World War II, Wills regularly outdrew the biggest swing bands in the country, including Tommy Dorsey and Benny Goodman. He was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1968 and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1999, an honor that recognized his role as an early architect whose influence cut across every genre line. In 1973, during a recording session meant as a tribute to his career, Wills suffered a massive stroke. He never regained consciousness and died on May 13, 1975, at the age of 70. The album from that final session, For the Last Time, was released posthumously and won a Grammy. Merle Haggard, one of countless country artists who worshipped Wills, would later record an entire tribute album to the man from Turkey, Texas, who changed the sound of America. Heading east to Nashville, we come to the famous Woodlawn Cemetery, where a man with one of the smoothest voices in the history of recorded music rests quietly. Gentleman Jim Reeves had a voice like velvet draped over midnight. Rich, deep, intimate, and so smooth it seemed almost supernatural. In the late 50s and early 60s, he was one of the biggest names in country music and a genuine international star, particularly beloved in South Africa, India, Sri Lanka, and across Europe, where he toured to sold-out crowds. He'll Have to Go reached number 2 on the pop charts in 1960, and Welcome to My World became his signature ballad. Reeves helped define what became known as the Nashville Sound, a polished orchestral approach to country music that traded honky-tonk grit for pop sophistication. His voice was so controlled, so technically perfect, that it almost didn't seem human. On July 31, 1964, Reeves was piloting his single-engine Beechcraft Debonair through a thunderstorm approaching Nashville when the plane crashed in dense woods just south of the city. Both Reeves and his pianist manager, Dean Manuel, perished on impact. He was 40 years old. His body wasn't recovered for 2 days because the crash site was so heavily wooded that search teams walked right past it. Remarkably, RCA Records continued releasing unreleased Reeves material for years after his death, and new overdubbed duets were created, pairing his voice with living artists. In some countries, particularly South Africa, where he was arguably more popular than Elvis, Jim Reeves remained a best-selling artist well into the 1980s, a dead man charting new hits 2 decades after his funeral. That's a kind of fame that defies the grave, even if the name has since faded from the American consciousness. In the countries where Reeves was most beloved, his records are still played on the radio. But in America, the country that produced him, Gentleman Jim is largely a ghost, his voice floating somewhere in the ether, waiting to be rediscovered. Another voice from that golden era of country music rests not in Nashville but in Winchester, Virginia, at Shenandoah Memorial Park. Patsy Cline didn't smooth the edges off country music the way Jim Reeves did. She grabbed its raw emotion with both hands and sang it with a power and clarity that made you believe every single word coming out of her mouth. Crazy, written for her by a young and still unknown Willie Nelson, is one of the most played jukebox songs in American history. I Fall to Pieces and Walkin' After Midnight were massive crossover hits that put her on pop radio alongside the biggest names in music. Cline was also a trailblazer for women in Nashville, demanding better pay, better material, and creative control at a time when the country music industry was run almost entirely by men. She was tough, she was funny, she swore like a sailor, and she had no patience for anyone who didn't take her seriously as an artist. She broke through to national fame on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts television program in 1957, winning the competition with a performance of Walkin' After Midnight that immediately generated a crossover hit. On March 5, 1963, returning from a benefit concert in Kansas City, the small Piper Comanche carrying Cline, her manager Randy Hughes, and fellow country stars Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas flew into deteriorating weather near Camden, Tennessee, and crashed in a forest. All 4 aboard were killed. Patsy Cline was 30 years old. She had been a major recording artist for barely 6 years, yet her influence on country music, and on every female vocalist who followed her through Nashville's doors, is beyond measuring. Her friend Loretta Lynn has said that Patsy Cline made it possible for every woman who came after her. After 2 lives cut short by plane crashes, let's visit someone who lived a long, full life but whose fame faded gradually into the Ozark Hills. We're in the foothills of Arkansas now, at Crossroads Cemetery near the tiny town of Timbo. Here lies Jimmy Driftwood, a name you may not recognize, but you absolutely know his most famous creation. Driftwood wrote The Battle of New Orleans, the same song that became a monster hit for Johnny Horton, whom we visited just a few minutes ago in Louisiana. Driftwood was a school teacher and folklorist from the Arkansas backcountry who penned hundreds of songs based on American history and Ozark tradition. He originally wrote The Battle of New Orleans simply as a teaching tool to help his 8th grade students remember the War of 1812, setting the lyrics to the melody of an old fiddle tune called The 8th of January. Driftwood's own recording of the song was a hit in 1959, but Johnny Horton's more polished version became the blockbuster. Driftwood won the Grammy for Song of the Year that same year, a schoolteacher from the hills of Stone County, Arkansas, beating out some of the biggest names in pop music for the music industry's highest songwriting honor. He was a character straight out of an American folk tale, a lean, weathered man who played a handmade guitar built from parts of an old fence rail and an ox yoke that had belonged to his grandfather. He spent the rest of his life collecting and preserving Ozark folk music, recording hundreds of traditional songs that might otherwise have been lost, and he was one of the driving forces behind the creation of the Ozark Folk Center in Mountain View, Arkansas, a living museum of traditional music, crafts, and culture that still operates today and draws visitors from around the world. Driftwood died on July 12, 1998, at the age of 91. A long life, lived close to the land and the music that came from it, and a reminder that sometimes the most enduring songs come not from a recording studio in Nashville or New York, but from a one-room schoolhouse in the hills. Now let's make a very long drive from the Ozarks across the Great Plains to Fargo, North Dakota. Here we find the grave of Bobby V, one of the biggest teen idols of the early 1960s, a clean-cut kid from the upper Midwest who got his break in the most extraordinary way imaginable. On February 3, 1959, the day the music died, as Don McLean would later call it, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper were killed in a plane crash near Clear Lake, Iowa. The remaining dates on their winter dance party tour still needed to be filled, and a 15-year-old Bobby V and his hastily formed band, The Shadows, volunteered to take the stage that very night in Moorhead, Minnesota. They knew maybe 5 songs. It didn't matter. The crowd was grateful, and Bobby V's career was launched. Within 2 years, he had a #1 hit with Take Good Care of My Baby, written by the brilliant songwriting team of Jerry Goffin and Carole King, and a string of top 10 singles including The Night Has a Thousand Eyes, Run to Him, and Devil or Angel. He was a fixture on American Bandstand, a teen magazine cover regular, and one of the biggest-selling pop artists in the country. His voice was clean, bright, and effortlessly appealing, the sound of American optimism before the 60s got complicated. But the British invasion of 1964 swept away most of the early 60s American pop idols almost overnight, and V's chart career faded. He continued performing on the nostalgia circuit for decades, a solid professional who always gave the audience its money's worth. In his later years, V was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and withdrew from public life. He died on October 24, 2016, at 73. One detail worth knowing. Before Bobby V made it big, he briefly hired a young piano player for his band. That kid's name was Robert Zimmerman. He later changed it to Bob Dylan. Speaking of that fateful night in February 1959, let's swing south to Beaumont, Texas and Forest Lawn Memorial Park, where one of the other 3 men on that plane now rests. J.P. Richardson, known to the world as the Big Bopper, was a Texas disc jockey and songwriter who scored one of the most infectious novelty hits of the 50s with Chantilly Lace, a song built entirely around a one-sided telephone conversation with his girlfriend. The record sold well over 1 million copies and made Richardson a rock and roll star practically overnight. He had a big, booming personality to match his large frame, and his stage presence was unforgettable. On that fatal night in Clear Lake, Iowa, Richardson wasn't even supposed to be on the plane. He had the flu and was feeling miserable, so he convinced Waylon Jennings, then just a 21-year-old bass player traveling with Buddy Holly's band, to give up his seat so Richardson could fly instead of enduring the long, freezing bus ride to the next show. Jennings agreed. As the story goes, Holly teased Jennings for choosing the bus, saying he hoped it froze up. Jennings shot back that he hoped Holly's plane crashed. It was a throwaway joke between young men, the kind of thing you'd forget by morning. Waylon Jennings never forgot it. He carried the guilt of that offhand remark for the rest of his life, mentioning it in interviews decades later with visible pain. Richardson was 28 years old. He left behind a pregnant wife. His son, J. Perry Richardson Jr., was born 2 months after the crash and never knew his father. In 2007, Richardson's body was exhumed and an autopsy was performed at the family's request. It confirmed that he had died of massive trauma from the crash and laid to rest persistent rumors that he might have survived the initial impact. The Big Bopper had just one major hit to his name, but Chantilly Lace remains one of the most recognizable rock and roll recordings of the 1950s, and the circumstances of his death ensured that his name would be forever linked to one of the darkest nights in American music. The third victim of that crash rests at Rose Hills Memorial Park in Whittier, California, one of the largest cemeteries in North America. Ritchie Valens, born Richard Stephen Valenzuela in the San Fernando Valley, was the first Mexican-American rock and roll star. At just 17 years old, he recorded La Bamba, a rock and roll arrangement of a traditional Mexican folk song from Veracruz, and Donna, a tender ballad written for his high school girlfriend Donna Ludwig. Donna reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, and La Bamba climbed to 22, a remarkable achievement for a song sung entirely in Spanish on American pop radio in the 1950s. Valens was a prodigy, a self-taught guitarist and songwriter who was writing and performing original material before he was old enough to drive. He had an irrational terror of flying, rooted in a childhood trauma when 2 planes collided over his school playground, killing several of his classmates, which makes the circumstances of his death all the more poignant. His professional recording career lasted barely 8 months before he boarded that chartered Beechcraft Bonanza in Mason City, Iowa. He reportedly flipped a coin with Tommy Allsup, one of Holly's band members, for the last seat on the plane. Valens won the toss. He was 17 years old when he died. His life was dramatized in the 1987 film La Bamba, starring Lou Diamond Phillips, and his grave still receives visitors regularly, many from the Chicano community that claims him as a foundational cultural figure. We've now visited all 3 musicians who died in that single crash, 3 graves scattered across Louisiana, Texas, and California, marking 3 lives lost on one cold Iowa night. From Southern California, let's head to the famous Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, the sprawling hillside cemetery that holds an astonishing number of Hollywood legends. Among the movie stars and studio moguls rests a musician whose contribution to the American songbook is almost impossible to overstate. Nat King Cole's voice, warm, intimate, instantly recognizable, made songs like Unforgettable, Mona Lisa, Nature Boy, and The Christmas Song. That's the one that begins chestnuts roasting on an open fire into permanent fixtures of American life. What most people today don't realize is that before Cole became one of the best-selling vocalists in the world, he was a brilliant jazz pianist. The King Cole Trio was an influential jazz combo in the 1940s that helped pioneer the small group format, piano, bass, and guitar, that would dominate jazz for decades. Cole was also a racial barrier breaker. In 1956, he became the first black performer to host his own network television variety show, The Nat King Cole Show, on NBC. The show was critically acclaimed and drew strong ratings, but it was canceled after about a year because no national sponsor would attach its name to a program hosted by a black man in the Jim Crow era. Cole reportedly said afterward that Madison Avenue was afraid of the dark. A lifetime of heavy smoking caught up with him. Cole had been a 3-pack-a-day man for most of his adult life, and lung cancer took Nat King Cole on February 15, 1965. He was just 45. His funeral at St. James Episcopal Church in Los Angeles drew hundreds of mourners from the entertainment world. His daughter, Natalie Cole, would carry on the family musical legacy, and in 1991, using emerging digital technology, she recorded an electronically produced duet with her late father on Unforgettable that won the Grammy for Record of the Year and Album of the Year, a daughter singing with a ghost across a gap of 26 years and making the whole world weep. Just across the city at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, we find another musician whose fame peaked early and ended in flames. Ricky Nelson, Eric Hilliard Nelson, grew up on television, raised in front of millions of Americans as a cast member of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, the long-running ABC sitcom starring his real-life parents and his older brother David. When teenage Ricky began recording pop songs in the late 1950s, he didn't need to build an audience. He already had one, tuning in every week. Poor Little Fool became the first #1 song on Billboard's newly created Hot 100 chart in 1958. Travelin' Man, Hello Mary Lou, and It's Late followed, making him one of the biggest teen idols of his era. But unlike most teen idols, Nelson was the real deal, a gifted singer and guitarist with genuine musical taste who listened to Carl Perkins, early rockabilly, and Fats Domino as much as he listened to the pop charts. His guitarist, James Burton, would later become Elvis Presley's lead guitarist, one of the finest pickers in the business, and a testament to Nelson's ear for real musicianship. As the 60s wore on and teen idolatry gave way to the counterculture, Nelson reinvented himself as a country rock artist. His 1972 single, Garden Party, written about being booed at a Madison Square Garden oldies revival concert for daring to play new material instead of his old hits, reached number 6 and became his signature statement of artistic independence. On New Year's Eve 1985, Nelson and his band were en route to a concert in Dallas when a fire broke out aboard their chartered DC-3, a World War II-era plane that had no business flying passengers. The aircraft crash-landed in a field near DeKalb, Texas. Nelson and 6 others died. He was 45. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted him in 1987. Let's trade the California sun for the Rio Grande Valley, heading to San Benito, Texas, near the Mexican border. At Mount Meta Memorial Park rests Freddy Fender, born Baldemar Huerta, a Tejano and country singer whose biggest hit arrived only after years of heartbreak and hard living. In 1975, Before the Next Teardrop Falls went to #1 on both the country and pop charts, a bilingual ballad sung partly in English and partly in Spanish, which was almost unheard of for a major American hit single at that time. The song resonated with English and Spanish speakers alike, a bridge between two cultures built from nothing but a good melody and a broken heart. Wasted Days and Wasted Nights, a song Fender had first recorded back in 1960, was re-released on the strength of the new hit and also topped the country chart. But Fender's journey to that moment had been brutal. A marijuana arrest in Baton Rouge in 1960 had cost him 3 years in Louisiana's notorious Angola State Prison, effectively ending his early career just as it was gaining momentum. After his release, he spent the next decade playing small clubs and cantinas in the South Texas bar circuit, virtually unknown outside the border region. His comeback was one of the great second-act stories in country music. In his later years, Fender was a member of the supergroup the Texas Tornadoes, alongside Doug Sahm, Augie Myers, and Flaco Jimenez. His health declined in his later years as hepatitis C ravaged his liver, and despite receiving both a liver and a kidney transplant, Freddy Fender died on October 14, 2006 at the age of 69. A man who lost everything, rebuilt from nothing, gave the world a song that still makes grown men cry, and is buried here in the border town where he grew up speaking Spanish before he ever learned a word of English. His story is the American dream at its most battered and beautiful. We're in Westchester County, New York, at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, where one of the towering figures of 20th century music rests. Thelonious Monk was one of the most important composers and pianists in the history of jazz. His angular, dissonant piano playing and his brilliantly unconventional compositions, Round Midnight, Straight, No Chaser, Blue Monk, Ruby, My Dear, Epistrophe, made him one of the founding fathers of bebop and one of the most recorded jazz composers of all time. Only Duke Ellington has had more of his pieces performed and recorded by other jazz musicians. Monk was famous for his eccentric behavior, his collection of distinctive hats, he owned dozens and was almost never seen without one, and his habit of getting up from the piano bench during other musicians' solos to dance in small, shuffling circles. Time magazine featured him on its cover in 1964, only the third jazz musician in history to receive that honor. In his final years, Monk withdrew almost completely from public life, living quietly in the Weehawken, New Jersey, home of his patron, the Baroness Pannonica de Koenigswarter. He stopped playing the piano and barely spoke. He seemed to simply drift away from the world, retreating into a silence that no one around him could penetrate. A stroke ended his life on February 17, 1982, at the age of 64. His son, T.S. Monk, became a jazz drummer and has devoted much of his life to preserving his father's legacy. Today, Thelonious Monk's music is played in jazz clubs around the world every single night. Round Midnight alone has been recorded by hundreds of artists, yet most people under 50 would draw a blank at his name. The music endures. The man behind it has largely vanished from popular memory. Also, here at Ferncliff rests a man whose melodies are known to virtually every American alive, even though the composer himself has slipped almost entirely from public memory. Harold Arlen wrote, "Over the Rainbow," "Stormy Weather," "That Old Black Magic," "Get Happy," "Come Rain or Come Shine," "One for My Baby," "Blues in the Night," and "Accent Chew Ate the Positive." A catalog of songs so deeply woven into American culture that you could hum any one of them in any room in this country, and somebody would join in. Arlen wrote more than 400 songs during his career, and an extraordinary number of them became enduring standards that have been recorded by virtually every major vocalist of the 20th century. Born Hyman Arluck in Buffalo, New York, the son of a cantor at a Jewish synagogue, his melodies drew from the cantorial traditions he heard in his father's services. From the blues he absorbed listening to African American musicians, and from the jazz that was transforming American popular music in the 1920s and 1930s. The result was a sound that was quintessentially, unmistakably American. Judy Garland sang his most famous composition in The Wizard of Oz in 1939, and Over the Rainbow became her signature song for the rest of her life. Arlen also wrote the score for A Star is Born and dozens of other films and Broadway shows. In his later years, depression and the decline of the Great American Songbook era, as rock and roll took over the charts and the old Tin Pan Alley tradition faded into history, left him increasingly isolated and forgotten. His wife, Anya, suffered from a debilitating illness that consumed their later years together. He died on April 23, 1986, at 81, largely unremembered by a public that sang his songs every day without knowing his name. If you know his songs, but not the man who wrote them, and you almost certainly do, you are in very large company, and that's a shame. Let's travel now to Detroit, Michigan and Woodlawn Cemetery. Here rests the first real superstar of Motown Records, a woman whose pioneering success made everything that followed at Berry Gordy's label possible. Before Diana Ross, before the Temptations conquered the charts, before Marvin Gaye became a legend, it was Mary Wells who put that fledgling Detroit record company on the national map. Her 1964 single My Guy, written and produced by the great Smokey Robinson, reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became Motown's first major crossover pop hit. Two Lovers, You Beat Me to the Punch, and The One Who Really Loves You were also significant chart successes. Wells had a sweet, intimate voice, not the biggest or the most powerful in the Motown stable, but one of the most appealing, warm and personal in a way that made you feel like she was singing just to you across a kitchen table. But at the peak of her success, Wells made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. At just 21, advised by her then-husband Herman Griffin that she was worth more than Motown was paying, she left the label, convinced she could negotiate a better deal elsewhere. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. No other label could recapture the alchemical magic of her collaboration with Smokey Robinson and the Motown production team, that combination of Robinson's songwriting genius, the Funk Brothers' incomparable musicianship, and Wells's sweet, inviting voice. She recorded for a succession of labels, 20th Century Fox, Atco, Jubilee, and none of it worked. Her career went into a steep, irreversible decline. By the 1970s and 1980s, She was performing in small clubs and on nostalgia package tours for modest fees, a long way from the #1 records and the Ed Sullivan appearances of her Motown heyday. In 1990, Wells was diagnosed with cancer of the larynx, a cruelty almost too perfect for a singer. Lacking health insurance, she struggled desperately to pay for treatment. Several fellow musicians rallied to her aid: Bruce Springsteen, Rod Stewart, Diana Ross, Aretha Franklin, and others donated money for her medical care. It wasn't enough. Mary Wells died on July 26, 1992, at the age of 49. The woman who gave Motown its first #1 is buried here in Detroit, the city she helped make the capital of popular music. About 30 minutes north of Mary Wells, at Ottawa Park Cemetery in Pontiac, Michigan, lies perhaps the most heartbreaking story on our entire tour. Florence Ballard founded the Supremes. She was the one who started it all, recruiting Diana Ross and Mary Wilson when they were all teenagers living in Detroit's Brewster Douglas housing projects in 1959. Originally calling themselves the Primettes, they signed with Motown and became the Supremes, eventually becoming the most commercially successful American vocal group of the 1960s. 12 #1 singles: Where Did Our Love Go?, Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop, In the Name of Love, Back in My Arms Again, I Hear a Symphony, You Can't Hurry Love, and more. But as Diana Ross emerged as the clear star, aided by Berry Gordy, who was romantically involved with Ross, Florence Ballard was pushed further and further into the background. She struggled with depression and alcohol. In 1967, Gordy forced her out of the group entirely and replaced her with Cindy Birdsong. Ballard signed a settlement giving up her rights to the Supremes' name and all future royalties in exchange for a modest lump sum, reportedly around $140,000, much of which went to legal fees and taxes. Her attempts at a solo career went nowhere. Her marriage to Thomas Chapman fell apart. The money ran out with frightening speed. The woman who had founded the biggest girl group in American history ended up on public assistance, raising 3 young daughters in a small apartment in Detroit. On February 22, 1976, Florence Ballard died of coronary artery thrombosis. She was 32 years old. Just weeks before her death, she had shown signs of a possible comeback, performing at a benefit concert to enthusiastic reviews. But the comeback never happened. Her grave here in Pontiac is a quiet, ordinary marker for a woman whose extraordinary talent was consumed by an industry that used her up and threw her away. In 2012, a new headstone was placed on Florence Ballard's grave, funded by fans who refused to let her be forgotten entirely. It reads, "I just want to be remembered for the beautiful music we made." Let's leave the Midwest and fly all the way to Oahu, Hawaii for something completely different. At Valley of the Temples Memorial Park in Kahalu, on the windward side of the island, rests a musician whose voice you have almost certainly heard, even if his name means nothing to you. Israel Kamakawiwool, known to the world as IZ or Bruda Is, recorded a gentle ukulele-accompanied medley of Somewhere Over the Rainbow and What a Wonderful World in a single take at a Honolulu recording studio in 1988. He reportedly called the studio at 3 in the morning and asked if he could come in and lay down a track. He arrived, sat down, and sang at once. That one take became one of the most streamed recordings in the history of music, used in dozens of films, television shows, and commercials. IZ was a beloved figure in Hawaii, a gentle giant who stood 6'2" and weighed over 700 pounds at his heaviest. His weight was a source of deep concern for his family and friends. But IZ seemed constitutionally incapable of denying himself the pleasures of life. He was a passionate advocate for Hawaiian sovereignty and the rights of native Hawaiians, and his music, which blended traditional Hawaiian sounds with reggae and contemporary pop influences, gave voice to a community that had long felt marginalized in its own homeland. His 1993 album Facing Future became the first Hawaiian album to be certified platinum and remains one of the best-selling Hawaiian albums of all time. When IZ died of respiratory failure on June 26, 1997, at only 38, the state of Hawaii flew its flag at half-staff, an honor normally reserved for government officials. Thousands of mourners lined the beaches as his ashes were scattered into the Pacific. He is also memorialized here at Valley of the Temples. IZ remains the most popular Hawaiian musician of all time, yet most of the millions who listen to his version of Over the Rainbow on their phones have no idea who sang it. Back to the mainland now, to Inglewood, California, and Inglewood Park Cemetery. Here lies a singer whose voice could shift from a whisper to a full-throated roar in a single phrase. Etta James, born Jamesetta Hawkins in Los Angeles, recorded At Last in 1961, and that song has become one of the most iconic love songs in American history. It's been played at countless thousands of weddings, and Beyoncé performed it at Barack Obama's first inaugural ball in 2009. James had a powerful, versatile voice that moved between rhythm and blues, jazz, rock, and gospel with equal authority. Tell Mama, Something's Got a Hold on Me, and I'd Rather Go Blind were among her other notable recordings. But James's career was repeatedly derailed by heroin addiction, which plagued her from her 20s through middle age. She was arrested multiple times and cycled through treatment facilities. Despite these setbacks, she made remarkable comebacks and continued recording vital, passionate music well into her 60s. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted her in 1993, and she won 6 Grammy Awards over her career, including a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2003. Etta James died on January 20, 2012, at the age of 73 from complications of leukemia. She had been suffering from Alzheimer's disease in her final years as well. A cruel fade for a woman whose artistry had been defined by its fierce emotional intelligence. Her version of At Last has taken on a life entirely of its own. It appears on more wedding playlists than perhaps any other song ever recorded, played for couples who have never heard of Etta James and likely never will. And yet the woman who sang it, who breathed such warmth and yearning into those notes, spent much of her own life in a bitter struggle with demons that nearly destroyed her. That the voice survived all of that. That it remained powerful and moving and achingly true through decades of addiction and hardship is its own quiet kind of miracle. Also at Inglewood Park, just a short walk away, rests a musician whose life could have been scripted by Raymond Chandler. Chet Baker was the golden boy of West Coast cool jazz in the early 1950s, strikingly handsome with a vulnerable, breathy singing voice and a trumpet tone so purely lyrical it could stop you in your tracks. His recordings of My Funny Valentine and I Fall in Love Too Easily made him simultaneously a jazz star and a teen idol, a combination that was almost unheard of in the world of jazz. He appeared on magazine covers looking like James Dean with a horn. Pacific Jazz Records marketed him as much for his looks as for his music, and he became the poster boy for an entire aesthetic of cool. Then, heroin consumed everything. Baker spent years in and out of addiction, traveling from country to country, getting arrested, getting deported, charming his way back in. Baker spent years in and out of addiction, and in 1968 he was brutally beaten, reportedly in a drug-related dispute, losing several teeth and temporarily losing his ability to play trumpet. He eventually taught himself to play again with dentures, and he spent his later decades performing mostly in Europe, where a small but devoted following sustained him. He was gaunt, weathered, and looked decades older than his age, but the music remained hauntingly beautiful. On May 13, 1988, Chet Baker fell from the second-floor window of the Prins Hendrik Hotel in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. He was 58. Whether the fall was accidental, drug-related, or intentional has never been conclusively determined. His remains were brought home to Inglewood. A few miles south at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City rests a man who combined wild showmanship with genuine musical chops in a way that nobody before or since has quite replicated. Spike Jones and his City Slickers were among the most popular musical acts in America during the 1940s and early 1950s. Jones took popular songs, classical pieces, big band standards, anything, and demolished them with gunshots, cowbells, car horns, washboards, and every manner of outrageous sound effect. His 1942 recording of Der Führer's Face, a song that savagely satirized Adolf Hitler, became a #1 hit and a wartime morale booster. Cocktails for Two, which turned a dreamy romantic ballad into a three-ring circus of sound effects, and All I Want for Christmas Is My Two Front Teeth were also enormous sellers. Jones sold millions of records and hosted his own television variety program. His comedy was anarchic and subversive, a kind of musical Monty Python decades before Monty Python existed. Weird Al Yankovic and Frank Zappa both cited him as a major influence. Emphysema ended his life on May 1, 1965, at the age of 53, a quiet passing for a man who spent his career making the loudest, most glorious racket in show business. At the height of his popularity in the late 1940s, Spike Jones was one of the top-selling recording artists in the country, and his concerts were elaborately staged spectacles of controlled mayhem. He proved something important about American popular culture: that audiences love nothing more than seeing something sacred gleefully destroyed. His City Slickers didn't just play music, they waged joyful, anarchic war on pretension and pomposity, and they won every battle they fought. Over at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, that tiny, unassuming cemetery tucked behind a row of high-rise office buildings, rests a singer who was blessed with one of the most extraordinary vocal ranges in the history of popular music. Minnie Riperton could sing a full 5 octaves, reaching effortlessly into the whistle register with a purity and control that left audiences slack-jawed. Her 1975 #1 hit, Lovin' You, with its soaring, high-note trills, showcased that astounding range for a national audience. The song was a lullaby, and it was written for her infant daughter, a baby girl named Maya Rudolph, who would grow up to become a beloved comedian and actress on Saturday Night Live. Before her solo breakthrough, Riperton had been a member of the psychedelic soul group Rotary Connection in the late 1960s, and she later sang backing vocals for Stevie Wonder on several of his classic 1970s albums, including Fulfillingness' first finale. Wonder became a close friend and mentor, and he co-produced her breakout album, Perfect Angel. In 1976, Riperton was diagnosed with breast cancer that had already spread. Rather than retreat from public view, she became one of the first high-profile celebrities to speak openly about the disease, working with the American Cancer Society to raise awareness at a time when cancer was something many Americans were afraid to discuss publicly. She received the organization's Courage Award from President Jimmy Carter at the White House. Breast cancer took Minnie Riperton on July 12, 1979. She was 31 years old. Stevie Wonder was reportedly at her bedside when she passed away. Her daughter Maya Rudolph has spoken movingly about growing up without her mother, and about learning the scope of Minnie Riperton's talent only gradually through the memories of others and the music she left behind. From Los Angeles, let's fly to New Orleans, a city whose very identity is inseparable from its music. At Providence Memorial Park in Metairie, just outside the city proper, lies one of the true architects of rock and roll. Before Elvis Presley, before Chuck Berry broke through to mainstream white audiences, Antoine Dominique Domino Jr., Fats Domino, was selling millions of records from a piano bench in the Crescent City. Ain't That a Shame, Blueberry Hill, I'm Walkin', Blue Monday, Whole Lotta Loving, and Walking to New Orleans were massive crossover hits in the 1950s and early 1960s. Domino sold more records during the 50s than any other rock and roll artist except Elvis Presley, an estimated 65 million singles. His rolling, boogie-woogie piano style and his warm, easygoing vocal delivery made the music sound almost casual, but underneath the easy groove was extraordinary musicianship. Despite his enormous success, Fats Domino was a modest, unpretentious man who famously disliked touring and rarely ventured far from New Orleans. While other rock and roll pioneers chased fame in Hollywood or New York, Domino stayed home. He lived in the same house in the lower 9th Ward for decades, a neighborhood fixture who could be seen sitting on his front porch, waving to neighbors. He was so beloved in New Orleans that the city treated him like royalty. and he returned the affection by staying loyal to the community that had raised him. When Hurricane Katrina devastated the city in August 2005, Domino was initially reported missing. It turned out he had refused to evacuate and was eventually rescued by a Coast Guard helicopter from his flooded home. He lost nearly everything. Instruments, gold records, memorabilia accumulated over half a century. But he rebuilt and stayed in the New Orleans area until his death on October 24, 2017, at the age of 89. His funeral was a traditional New Orleans jazz procession, with a brass band leading mourners through the streets, the kind of send-off the Crescent City reserves for its truest royalty. Also at Providence Memorial Park rests a man whose songs are among the most recognizable in the history of American music, even though the man himself remains almost completely unknown to the general public. Allen Toussaint was a songwriter, arranger, producer, and pianist who functioned as the creative engine behind many of the greatest recordings to come out of New Orleans. He wrote Mother-in-Law for Ernie K. Doe, Working in the Coal Mine and Ride Your Pony for Lee Dorsey, Fortune Teller for Benny Spellman, and Southern Nights for Glenn Campbell. He produced the original version of Lady Marmalade for LaBelle. His rhythmic innovations were foundational to funk music. He essentially helped create the syncopated, groove-heavy template that artists like Dr. John the Meters and the Neville Brothers would build their careers upon. The Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney, Elvis Costello, and Robert Plant all sought him out as a collaborator. Yet Toussaint was content to remain behind the scenes, a quiet, impeccably dressed, unfailingly polite man in a city full of loud, extravagant ones. He wore suits every day, even to rehearsals, and conducted himself with a courtly grace that seemed to belong to another century. When Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005, Toussaint was displaced to New York, and the experience deeply affected him. He eventually returned and became a vocal advocate for the city's rebuilding. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1998 and the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2011. On November 10, 2015, after performing a concert at the Teatro Lara in Madrid, Spain, still touring, still playing, still bringing New Orleans to the world, Allen Toussaint suffered a heart attack in his hotel room and died. He was 77 years old. The city of New Orleans named a street after him. Let's head east to Macon, Georgia, and Rose Hill Cemetery, an old Southern burial ground on the banks of the Ocmulgee River with a rich musical history. Here lie two musicians whose lives were cut short in hauntingly similar fashion. Howard Duane Allman co-founded the Allman Brothers Band, the group that essentially invented Southern rock as a genre, and his astonishing slide guitar work as a session musician on Eric Clapton's Layla earned him a permanent reputation as one of the greatest guitarists in the history of recorded music. Those searing, weeping slide guitar notes in the extended coda of Layla, that gorgeous, aching piano and guitar passage that transforms the song from a great rock track into something genuinely transcendent, are Duane Allman's signature on the wall of rock and roll history. With the Allman Brothers, he fused blues, country, and jazz into long, exploratory jams that redefined what a rock band could do on stage, and influenced everyone from the Grateful Dead to Lynyrd Skynyrd to the jam band scene that flourishes to this day. On October 29, 1971, Allman was riding his Harley-Davidson motorcycle through Macon when he swerved to avoid a flatbed truck that had stopped suddenly at an intersection, lost control, and was thrown from the bike. He was 24 years old. The Allman Brothers Band was on the cusp of massive mainstream success. Their live album, At Fillmore East, had just been released to extraordinary reviews and was climbing the charts. Duane Allman never saw it. Tragically, just 13 months later, the Allman Brothers Band's bassist, Barry Oakley, was killed in a motorcycle accident just 3 blocks from where Duane had crashed. Oakley was also 24. He is buried near Duane here at Rose Hill, their graves side by side. 2 young musicians, 2 motorcycles, 2 nearly identical deaths, barely a year apart, in the same small Georgia city. The coincidence still haunts fans of the band, and the 2 graves have become a pilgrimage site for guitar players from around the world. From Georgia, let's travel up the coast to Philadelphia and Ivy Hill Cemetery, where a singer whose impact on modern rhythm and blues is far greater than most people today realize rests quietly among the old headstones. Teddy Pendergrass was the lead vocalist of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, and his gruff, passionate baritone powered some of the definitive records of the Philadelphia soul movement. If you don't know me by now, The Love I Lost and Wake Up Everybody. When Pendergrass went solo in 1977, he became one of the biggest R&B artists in the country. He was among the first male R&B singers to record entire albums of slow-burning love ballads, the romantic, sensual format that Luther Vandross, Keith Sweat, R. Kelly, and many others would later adopt as their signature style. His live concerts, often marketed as for women-only events, were legendary for their intensity and intimacy. Thousands of women in the audience, many throwing undergarments onto the stage, while Pendergrass, with his muscular build and commanding stage presence, performed love songs directly to them. He was one of the first male R&B artists to be marketed explicitly as a sex symbol, and it worked spectacularly. Then, on March 18, 1982, at the absolute peak of his fame and creative power, Teddy Pendergrass was driving his Rolls-Royce on the winding curves of Lincoln Drive in Philadelphia when the car struck a guardrail and crashed into two trees. The accident left him a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the chest down. He was 31 years old. The loss to music was incalculable. Pendergrass was selling out arenas and seemed destined for the kind of career that Michael Jackson and Prince were building simultaneously. He eventually returned to recording and performing from his wheelchair, and he made a memorable and emotional appearance at the Live Aid concert in Philadelphia in 1985. He scored a hit with his duet with Whitney Houston, Hold Me, in 1984. But the career that had been rocketing towards superstardom never regained its full trajectory. Pendergrass died on January 13, 2010, at the age of 59, from respiratory failure following colon surgery. He had spent 28 years in a wheelchair, longer than the career that put him in it. Let's cross the country now to Kansas City, Missouri, and Highland Cemetery, where a foundational figure of rock and roll rests in relative obscurity. Big Joe Turner had a voice so enormous that in the pre-microphone era of the 1930s and 1940s, he could be heard over an entire swinging Kansas City orchestra without any amplification at all. They called him the boss of the blues. In 1954, Turner recorded Shake, Rattle, and Roll for Atlantic Records, and the song became one of the first rock and roll recordings to cross over from the R&B charts to the pop mainstream. Bill Haley and his Comets had a bigger pop hit with their sanitized cover version, but Big Joe Turner's original, rawer, looser, and far more suggestive, was the genuine article. Turner had been a major figure in the Kansas City jazz and blues scene since the 1930s, singing the boogie, woogie, and jump blues that were the direct musical ancestors of rock and roll. His career spanned more than 4 decades, beginning in the speakeasy clubs of Prohibition-era Kansas City, where he started out as a singing bartender, pouring drinks with one hand and belting the blues with a voice that could rattle the walls. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted him in 1987, in only its second year of existence, a testament to just how foundational his contribution was to the music that changed the world. Turner died on November 24, 1985, at the age of 74. He had kept performing almost until the end, even as diabetes cost him a leg and confined him to a wheelchair. He'd sit on stage in that wheelchair and sing with all the power he'd had at 25. Big Joe Turner is one of those artists whose name should be spoken in the same breath as Elvis, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. Without him, without that Kansas City shouting style that bridged the gap between big band jazz and rock and roll, the music might have taken a very different path. Heading north to the Chicago suburbs, we arrive at Burr Oak Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois, where two giants of American music rest side by side in a cemetery that has seen its share of troubles. Let's start with Dinah Washington, one of the greatest jazz and blues vocalists of the 20th century, a woman whose voice could command any room and whose personality could dominate any stage. Washington was called the Queen of the Blues, though her remarkable versatility meant she could sing jazz standards, R&B hits, pop ballads, and gospel hymns with equal command, equal conviction, and equal fire. Her 1959 recording of What a Difference a Day Makes was a silky, sophisticated pop crossover that reached number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 and won the Grammy for Best Rhythm and Blues Recording. She had a sharp, clear voice with impeccable phrasing and an off-stage personality every bit as formidable. Washington was famous for her sharp tongue, her lavish spending, her extravagant wardrobe, and the fact that she went through 7 husbands. She once threw a plate of food at a club owner who shorted her fee, and she had a well-known habit of confronting any female singer who she felt was encroaching on her territory. But beneath the diva persona was an artist of extraordinary sensitivity. Her ballad performances could be devastatingly intimate. Dinah Washington died on December 14, 1963, at the age of just 39, from an accidental combination of sleeping pills and alcohol at her home in Detroit. She had been at the peak of a remarkable career resurgence. The timing was doubly tragic. It was barely 3 weeks after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and her passing went almost unnoticed in the national grief. Aretha Franklin, who grew up listening to Washington in Detroit churches and on the radio, later cited her as the single most important influence on her own singing. When Aretha became the Queen of Soul, she was building on a foundation that Dinah Washington had laid. Right here at Burr Oak, near Dinah Washington, rests another figure whose name draws blank looks from most people, yet whose songs are woven into the very fabric of rock and roll. Willie Dixon was a bassist, vocalist, songwriter, arranger, and producer who served as the creative backbone of Chess Records in Chicago during the golden age of electric blues in the 1950s and 1960s. Dixon wrote Hoochie Coochie Man for Muddy Waters, I Just Want to Make Love to You for Muddy Waters, Little Red Rooster for Howlin' Wolf, Spoonful for Howlin' Wolf, Backdoor Man for Howlin' Wolf, Wang Dang Doodle for Coco Taylor, I Can't Quit You Baby for Otis Rush, and You Shook Me for Muddy Waters. Every one of those songs was later covered and made famous all over again by British and American rock bands. The Rolling Stones recorded Little Red Rooster and I Just Want to Make Love to You. Cream recorded Spoonful, The Doors recorded Backdoor Man, and Led Zeppelin recorded I Can't Quit You Baby, You Shook Me, and Bring It On Home. In fact, Led Zeppelin's first 2 albums are practically Willie Dixon tribute records. When Zeppelin failed to properly credit Dixon for Whole Lotta Love, which borrows heavily from his song You Need Love, Dixon sued and received a settlement. He spent his later years advocating tirelessly for the rights of blues musicians who had been exploited by the recording industry, founding the Blues Heaven Foundation, which operates today out of the old Chess Records building at 2120 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, the very studio where many of his greatest songs were recorded. Dixon was also an imposing physical presence. He stood 6'6" and weighed over 250 pounds. And he had been an amateur boxer in his youth, good enough to win the Illinois State Golden Gloves Heavyweight Championship in 1936. Willie Dixon died on January 29, 1992, at the age of 76. The man who wrote the songs that powered classic rock and roll, songs that earned untold millions for the British and American bands who covered them, has been largely forgotten by the audience that still loves those songs. That's an injustice worth correcting. From Chicago, let's travel to Oakland, California, and Evergreen Cemetery. Here lies a singer who was a pioneer in ways that went far beyond music. Sylvester, he performed under just his first name, was a disco and high-NRG vocalist whose soaring falsetto and flamboyant stage presence made him an icon of the late 1970s dance music scene and an important early figure for LGBTQ representation in popular music. His 1978 singles You Make Me Feel Mighty Real and Dance, Disco Heat were massive club hits that helped define the sound of the disco era. Sylvester was gender non-conforming decades before that concept entered the mainstream conversation. He wore women's clothing on stage, performed with a troupe of fabulous backup singers called 2 Tons of Fun, who later became the Weather Girls of It's Raining Men fame, and refused to hide any aspect of who he was at a time when doing so carried genuine danger. His music has experienced a significant revival in recent years, recognized as an important precursor to house music and electronic dance music. The pulsing synthesizer lines and 4-on-the-floor beat of You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real, produced by the pioneering Patrick Cowley, are now considered foundational to the entire genre of electronic dance music. Sylvester died on December 16, 1988, at the age of 41 from AIDS-related complications, at a time when the epidemic was devastating San Francisco's gay community. In his will, he left all future royalties from his music to 2 San Francisco-based AIDS charities, Project Open Hand and the AIDS Emergency Fund. A final act of generosity from a man who had spent his entire career being generous with his talent, his spirit, and his willingness to be exactly who he was. The Mississippi Delta is next, the place where the blues were born. Near Ebenezer, Mississippi, in a small church cemetery, lies the grave of Elmore James, one of the most influential blues guitarists who ever lived. His 1951 recording of Dust My Broom, with its electrifying distorted slide guitar introduction, is one of the foundational recordings of electric blues. That opening riff, 3 rapid-fire notes repeated in a driving, hypnotic pattern, has been quoted, copied, and built upon by thousands of guitarists in the 7 decades since. James played with a ferocity and raw emotional intensity that anticipated everything from Jimi Hendrix's feedback-drenched improvisations to the stripped-down aggression of punk rock. He had a rough, passionate singing voice and a slide guitar sound that was instantly recognizable, aggressive, overdriven, and absolutely thrilling. He suffered from heart disease for years, but refused to slow down or stop performing. James was born in Richland, Mississippi, and learned to play guitar on a homemade instrument fashioned from a broomstick and a tin can, a 1-string diddley bow, which was common among rural blues musicians in the Delta. He served in the Navy during World War II and returned to Mississippi to begin his recording career. His influence on the British blues revival was enormous. The Rolling Stones, Fleetwood Mac, and John Mayall's Blues Breakers all covered his songs. Jeremy Spencer of Fleetwood Mac was so obsessed with James's slide guitar style that much of the band's early repertoire consisted of Elmore James songs. A heart attack took Elmore James on May 24, 1963 in Chicago, at the age of 45. His body was returned to Mississippi for burial, to a small cemetery near the church where he'd grown up singing gospel as a boy. His music is considered essential listening by blues scholars and rock historians, yet his name is known mainly to the devoted few who understand that without Elmore James, the electric guitar might never have learned to cry. From the Delta, let's drive west to Fort Worth, Texas, and Greenwood Memorial Park, where one of the most revolutionary and most controversial musicians of the 20th century rests. Ornette Coleman's 1960 album, Free Jazz, gave its name to an entire musical movement and divided the jazz world right down the middle. His slightly earlier album, The Shape of Jazz to Come, is routinely ranked among the most important and influential recordings in the history of jazz. Coleman abandoned conventional harmony, chord changes, and song structure in favor of collective improvisation, creating music that was raw, spontaneous, and utterly unlike anything that had come before. Some musicians and critics hailed him as a visionary genius. Others, including Miles Davis at least initially, were openly hostile. Coleman played a white plastic saxophone, which only added to the sense that he was deliberately thumbing his nose at tradition. He also developed a musical philosophy he called harmolodics, which influenced artists across multiple genres, from jazz to punk to classical composition. Despite his enormous influence on the trajectory of modern music, Ornette Coleman remained a somewhat obscure figure outside of dedicated jazz and avant-garde circles. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Music in 2007 for his album Sound Grammar, a belated recognition from the establishment of a musician who had spent his career challenging every musical establishment there was. In Fort Worth, where he grew up in extreme poverty, there is now a park named in his honor. He died on June 11, 2015, at the age of 85, having spent more than 5 decades making music that was ahead of its time, and that, in some ways, still is. For a story that sounds like pure fiction but is absolutely, completely true, let's go to Southfield, Michigan, just outside Detroit. At Holy Sepulchre Cemetery rests Sixto Rodriguez, a folk rock singer-songwriter from Detroit who released 2 albums in the early 1970s, Cold Fact and Coming From Reality, that were critical and commercial failures in the United States. His record label dropped him, and Rodriguez went back to manual labor, working construction and renovation jobs around Detroit for the next 20 years. He raised a family. He ran for local office a couple of times, and lost. He was, by all appearances, a regular working-class guy in a tough city. What Sixto Rodriguez did not know was that, through a chain of bootleg copies, his albums had somehow found their way to South Africa, where they became phenomenally, wildly popular. In apartheid-era South Africa, Rodriguez was as big as the Beatles, as big as Elvis. His anti-establishment, socially conscious lyrics, songs about inner-city poverty, drug culture, government corruption, and personal liberation, resonated deeply with the liberal white South Africans who opposed the apartheid regime. His albums sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Students played them in dormitory rooms. His songs were quoted at anti-apartheid rallies. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most famous and beloved musicians in the country. But because of South Africa's cultural isolation under apartheid, nobody there could find any information about him. Rumors circulated that Rodriguez had died, that he had taken his own life on stage or been murdered, or simply vanished. In the late 1990s, a small group of South African music fans launched an investigation that finally tracked Rodriguez down. He was alive. He was living in a small house in Detroit. He was working with his hands for a living. He had absolutely no idea that he was famous on the other side of the world. The whole extraordinary story was told in the 2012 documentary Searching for Sugar Man, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Rodriguez finally toured internationally, playing to rapturous, weeping audiences in South Africa, Australia, and Europe. Arenas full of people who knew every word to songs that their singer had given up on decades ago. By all accounts, Rodriguez accepted his late-in-life fame with extraordinary grace and humility. He continued to live simply in Detroit, reportedly giving away much of the money from his belated concert tours. He died on August 8, 2023, at the age of 81. It is one of the most improbable stories in the history of popular music. A man forgotten in his own country, worshipped in another, and lost to both until a handful of determined fans decided to find out what had happened to the voice on those old records. Let's trade the remarkable for the refined, heading to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the beautiful grounds of Mount Auburn Cemetery, a National Historic Landmark and one of the most elegant burial grounds in the United States. Among its stately oaks and winding paths rests Arthur Fiedler, who conducted the Boston Pops Orchestra for an extraordinary 50 years, from 1930 to 1979. Fiedler transformed the Pops from a respectable but relatively obscure summer orchestra into one of the most popular and commercially successful musical ensembles in the world. Under his energetic direction, the Boston Pops released dozens of best-selling albums, appeared frequently on television, and inaugurated the famous 4th of July concerts on the Charles River Esplanade that became one of America's most cherished annual traditions, broadcast live every year on national television. Fiedler's particular genius, and it was genius, even if classical music purists sometimes sneered at it, was his ability to make classical and popular music accessible to a mass audience without dumbing down either one. He'd program Beethoven alongside Broadway show tunes, Tchaikovsky next to the Beatles, Sousa marches next to movie themes. He believed that great music was great music regardless of where it came from, and he communicated that belief with infectious enthusiasm from the podium night after night, year after year, for half a century. Fiedler appeared on the cover of Time magazine, sold more records than most pop stars of his generation, and became one of the most recognized conductors in the world. He died on July 10, 1979, at 84. His successor on the Boston Pop's podium, John Williams, would bring his own considerable fame to the role. But it was Arthur Fiedler who built the institution and made the idea of an accessible, popular orchestra part of American life. From the elegant grounds of New England, let's plunge into the swampy backroads of southern Louisiana. In Scotlandville, just north of Baton Rouge, lies Slim Harpo, born James Isaac Moore, a blues harmonica player and singer whose laid-back, easygoing Louisiana swamp blues sound had a profound and lasting influence on the British rock bands of the 1960s. Harpo's 1957 single, I'm a King Bee, was covered by the Rolling Stones on their debut album in 1964. It was one of the very first songs Mick Jagger and Keith Richards ever recorded together as a band. Baby Scratch My Back, with its distinctive scratchy guitar and harmonica groove, was a #1 R&B hit in 1966. And Shake Your Hips was later covered by the Rolling Stones on their landmark 1972 album, Exile on Main Stirpler. Harpo's relaxed, drawling vocal style and his simple but infectious musical arrangements made him a favorite of blues fans on both sides of the Atlantic. His real name, James Moore, is rarely mentioned. The stage name Slim Harpo, a nod to his harmonica playing and lanky build, was invented by his producer, the legendary J.D. Miller, who recorded much of the best Louisiana blues and swamp pop of the era in his small Crowley, Louisiana studio. Harpo supplemented his music income by working as a longshoreman and house painter for much of his career, a reminder of how little most blues musicians earned from the records that made them famous. He was finally on the verge of a major career breakthrough, having just signed a lucrative deal to tour Europe and the United Kingdom, where his music was revered, when a heart attack struck him down on January 31, 1970, at the age of 46. Slim Harpo never got to see just how far across the ocean his music had traveled, or to experience the adulation of the young British musicians who worshipped his records. Let's fly north now to the Bronx in New York City and the grand old Woodlawn Cemetery, not to be confused with the Nashville Woodlawn we visited many miles ago. This storied New York burial ground is a who's who of American history and culture. Among its distinguished residents is Lionel Hampton, one of the most important and beloved figures in the history of jazz. Hampton was the first musician to popularize the vibraphone as a lead jazz instrument, and his career spanned an almost unbelievable 7 decades. He got his big break in 1930 when Louis Armstrong invited the young Hampton to join a recording session, and the crisp, shimmering sound of Hampton's vibraphone immediately captured the jazz world's attention. He went on to join Benny Goodman's band, becoming part of the Benny Goodman Quartet, one of the first racially integrated musical groups in American jazz, alongside Goodman, pianist Teddy Wilson, and drummer Gene Krupa. Their performances together were not just musically groundbreaking, but socially significant in the Jim Crow era. Hampton's 1942 recording of Flying Home, featuring a wild, honking saxophone solo by Illinois Jacquet, is considered one of the seminal recordings in the development of rhythm and blues. The saxophone break essentially invented the sound that would power rock and roll a decade later. Hampton led his own big band for decades after that, playing with an energy and joy that were utterly contagious well into his 80s. He also pursued an unlikely second career in real estate development, building multiple affordable housing complexes in Harlem, the Lionel Hampton Houses and the Lionel Hampton Gardens, a side of his legacy that is almost as impressive as the music. He was awarded the National Medal of Arts and received honorary degrees from dozens of universities. Lionel Hampton died on August 31, 2002, at the remarkable age of 94, having spent more time on the bandstand than almost any other musician in American history. Back to Tennessee now, to Hendersonville Memory Gardens, the cemetery near Nashville where Johnny Cash and the Carter family rest. But today, we're not here for the man in black. We're here for a neighbor of his in these quiet grounds. Conway Twitty, born Harold Lloyd Jenkins in Friars Point, Mississippi, had one of the most unusual career arcs in the history of popular music. He first found fame as a rock and roll singer in the late 1950s, scoring a #1 pop hit in 1958 with It's Only Make Believe, a dramatic building ballad that sounded so much like Elvis Presley that many radio listeners, and even some disc jockeys, assumed it was the King. Twitty toured the rock and roll circuit for several years, but by the late 1960s, he had completely reinvented himself as a country artist. The transformation was one of the most successful genre pivots in music history. Over the next 2.5 decades, Conway Twitty accumulated an astonishing 55 #1 country singles, more than any other artist has ever achieved, a record that still stands. His string of duets with Loretta Lynn produced 5 #1 hits and won the Country Music Association's Vocal Duo of the Year award 4 consecutive times. Songs like Hello Darlin', Tight Fittin' Jeans, and I'd Love to Lay You Down were country radio staples throughout the 70s and 80s. Twitty was also a shrewd businessman who built a theme park in Hendersonville called Twitty City, which housed his home and offices and welcomed fans for tours. His stage name, incidentally, was cobbled together from Conway, Arkansas, and Twitty, Texas, 2 towns on a road map that had nothing else in common until Harold Jenkins linked them forever. Despite this extraordinary body of work, 55 #1s is a staggering achievement that even the biggest names in country music today cannot approach. Twitty's name has faded considerably from public consciousness. He was never inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame during his lifetime, an oversight that still baffles fans. He died suddenly on June 5, 1993, at the age of 59, when an abdominal aortic aneurysm ruptured while he was riding on his tour bus between shows. He had performed the night before without a sign of trouble. He was finally inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1999, 6 years too late. Let's travel now to Portland, Oregon and Riverview Cemetery, perched on a hillside overlooking the Willamette River. Here rests a man who was arguably the first true rock and roll era pop star. A singer whose emotional performances anticipated Elvis Presley by half a decade, and who electrified audiences in a way that nobody had quite seen before. Johnny Ray's 1951 single Cry spent 11 weeks at #1 on the Billboard charts and sold over 2 million copies. He was dubbed the Prince of Wales and the Nabob of Sob for his histrionic stage manner. He wept openly while singing, dropped to his knees, tore at his clothing, contorted his face with emotion, and generally behaved in a way that drove teenage girls into absolute hysterics. This was years before Elvis shook his hips on Ed Sullivan, years before Beatlemania. Johnny Ray was the original teen idol pandemonium act. He was also partially deaf in one ear from a childhood accident, a blanket toss at a Boy Scout jamboree went wrong, and wore a hearing aid on stage, which only made his intensely emotional singing style more remarkable and endearing to fans. Frank Sinatra reportedly detested him. Critics sneered. But teenagers couldn't get enough. Ray's other hits included The Little White Cloud That Cried and Just Walking in the Rain, and he was a genuine international star for most of the 1950s. Ray was also gay in an era when exposure could mean the end of everything, and a 1959 arrest in a Detroit police sting operation, though the charges were ultimately dropped, severely damaged his reputation in the American market and effectively ended his run as a major domestic star. He remained popular in Britain and Australia for years afterward, where audiences were more forgiving or perhaps less aware, but he never regained his footing at home. Alcohol took an increasing toll on his health and his performances. Johnny Ray died on February 24, 1990, at the age of 63, from liver failure. His influence on the physical, emotional, explosive performance style that would come to define rock and roll is enormous and almost completely unrecognized today. Every screaming teenager at an Elvis concert, every girl fainting at a Beatles show, every mosh pit at a punk gig owes something to Johnny Ray, the deaf kid from Oregon who taught pop music how to feel in public. From Portland, let's cross the Atlantic Ocean one final time to a quiet churchyard in Henley-on-Thames, a gentle riverside town in the English county of Oxfordshire. Dusty Springfield, born Mary Isabel Catherine Bernadette O'Brien, was one of the finest blue-eyed soul singers who ever lived. Her voice had the emotional depth of Aretha Franklin, the sophistication of Dionne Warwick, and a husky, yearning quality that was entirely her own. Son of a preacher man, from her landmark 1969 album Dusty in Memphis, is one of the great recordings of the entire rock era, a track so perfectly conceived and performed that Quentin Tarantino selected it for a pivotal scene in Pulp Fiction 25 years after its release, introducing it to a new generation. I Only Want to Be With You, Wishin' and Hopin', and You Don't Have to Say You Love Me were all major hits on both sides of the Atlantic during the British invasion era. Springfield was a genuine pop superstar in the 1960s, one of the biggest-selling female artists in the world, and she was also a courageous champion of Black American music in Britain. She introduced British television audiences to Motown and soul performers at a time when most British variety shows wouldn't book them. Her career waned in the 1970s as she struggled with personal demons, addiction, and the loneliness of hiding her sexuality in a world that was not yet ready to accept her. She retreated from the spotlight for nearly a decade, living in Los Angeles and fading from public view. Then, in 1987, the Pet Shop Boys invited her to sing on What Have I Done to Deserve This?, and the song became a top 2 hit in both America and Britain. Springfield was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in March 1999. Just weeks later, on March 2nd, breast cancer claimed her. She was 59 years old. Her ashes were scattered partly at Henley-on-Thames and partly at the cliffs of Moher in Ireland. Her voice, that extraordinary instrument, husky and yearning and utterly distinctive, remains one of the treasures of recorded music. Back across the Atlantic for our final 2 stops. First, to Newark, New Jersey, and Glendale Cemetery. Here lies Sarah Vaughan, who possessed what many jazz critics have called the most beautiful voice in the entire history of jazz. And who are we to argue? Her rich operatic mezzo-soprano spanned more than 3 octaves, and her facility for melodic improvisation. The ability to take a melody and reshape it spontaneously, finding new beauty in every note, was breathtaking. Known variously as the Divine One and Sassy, Vaughan rose through the bebop movement alongside Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker in the 1940s. She won an amateur night contest at the Apollo Theater in Harlem in 1942. And from that moment on, her trajectory was set. She went on to a career that lasted 4 decades, recording for every major label and performing in concert halls and jazz festivals around the world. Her recordings of Misty, Broken-Hearted Melody, Lullaby of Birdland, and Send in the Clowns are considered among the finest vocal performances in the history of jazz. She won 4 Grammy Awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award in 1989. Musicians who worked with her spoke of her voice with something approaching awe. Dizzy Gillespie once said that Sarah Vaughan had the finest voice in the business. Despite the sheer magnificence of her artistry, an artistry that placed her alongside Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday in what many critics consider the holy trinity of jazz singing, Sarah Vaughan has faded from mainstream recognition, her name known primarily to jazz enthusiasts and music scholars. She deserves so much more. Lung cancer claimed her on April 3, 1990, at the age of 66. And now, for our 40th and final stop, let's make the journey to Huntsville, Alabama and Oakwood Memorial Gardens, located on the campus of Oakwood University. Here, in a quiet corner of a small Seventh-day Adventist university in North Alabama, rests one of the undisputed founders of rock and roll, and one of the most explosive performers the world has ever seen. With his towering pompadour, his mascara-lined eyes, his screaming, howling, impossibly energetic vocals, and his pounding, relentless piano, Little Richard was rock and roll's wildest, most uninhibited, most electrifying performer. Period. Tutti Frutti, released in 1955, was a sonic bomb that blew the doors off American popular music. Long Tall Sally, Good Golly Miss Molly, Lucille, Rip It Up, Jenny Jenny, and Keep a Knockin' followed in rapid succession, each one a masterclass in pure, unfiltered musical energy. These records didn't just cross the racial divide in 1950s America, they shattered it. White teenagers and black teenagers were dancing to the same music, buying the same records, screaming at the same concerts. Little Richard's influence on the musicians who followed him is incalculable. The Beatles idolized him. Paul McCartney has said repeatedly that Little Richard was the direct model for his own rock and roll singing voice, and that without Little Richard, there would have been no Beatles. Jimi Hendrix played guitar in Little Richard's band before striking out on his own. James Brown studied his stage moves. Prince took his flamboyance and ran with it into the stratosphere. Mick Jagger, Bob Dylan, David Bowie, all of them owed a debt to the man from Macon, Georgia, who had the courage to be exactly who he was in an era that demanded conformity. And yet, in his later years, Richard Wayne Penniman felt overlooked and undercompensated for his world-changing contributions. He spent decades alternating between the rock and roll stage and the pulpit, struggling with questions of faith and identity that were never fully resolved. He never received the sustained, ongoing cultural veneration that was given to Elvis Presley, and it bothered him, as well it should have. Bone cancer took Little Richard on May 9, 2020, at the age of 87. His funeral was private, held right here on the Oakwood campus where he had briefly studied seminary back in the 1950s, before the music called him away to a different kind of church entirely. The man who arguably did more than any other single human being to create the look and the sound and the fury and the joy of rock and roll rests here in a modest spot on a small university campus in North Alabama. It is an ending that feels both fitting and profoundly insufficient for someone who gave the world so much. And with that, our long tour comes to a close. We've traveled thousands of miles today, from the pine forests of Louisiana to the beaches of Hawaii, from the Mississippi Delta to a churchyard in the English countryside, visiting the graves of 40 musicians who once stood at the very center of American popular music. Some of them changed the world with a single song. Others changed it with decades of work that most people have since forgotten. A few of them died heartbreakingly young, 17, 24, 28, 30. Others lived long, full lives and simply faded from view as the spotlight moved on to the next generation and the generation after that. But their music, that hasn't gone anywhere. It's still out there, on the radio, on your streaming service, in the soundtrack of a movie you saw last week, in the DNA of every song your grandchildren listen to. The songs survive, even when the names behind them do not. Thank you for walking with us today. And the next time one of these songs comes on, and one of them will, probably before the day is over, maybe you'll think of the person who made it and where they're resting now, and the remarkable, improbable, sometimes tragic, sometimes triumphant life they lived to bring that music into the world.